Hello and welcome to China Talk. Evan Osnos is a correspondent for The New Yorker. We'll be talking about the protests in the US, Trump, Xi, and US China relations. We're recording this episode on June 8th. Evan, thanks for coming on China Talk.
My pleasure, Jordan. Thanks for having me.
So I find it unbelievable that it is even remotely possible to have a conversation comparing something happening in the US in 2020 with Tiananmen, but here we are. So a few days ago, Bill Bishop in his newsletter Sinocism highlighted an article winding its way around WeChat that takes Deng's famous public speech given 1 week after the events in Tiananmen and rewrites it to apply to Trump today. So the initial two lines were, although some comrades may not understand this for a while, we will eventually understand and support the decision of the Central Committee. Perhaps this is a bad thing that will enable us to go ahead with the reform and opening policy at a steadier, better, and even faster pace to more speedily correct our mistakes and better develop our strong points. Two, although some comrades may not understand this for a while, they will eventually understand this and support the decision of the Republican Party. Perhaps this thing will enable us to go further ahead with MAGA at a steadier, faster, and even better pace.
Yeah.
I don't know. Evan, take it from here.
Well, you know what's interesting about this, Jordan? It's such an interesting moment. Obviously, this almost bizarre cosmic overlap of the anniversary of June 4th, the massacre at Tiananmen, with the very moment that we're having this national protest movement in the United States. For anybody who is an American China nerd, this is just kind of powerfully evocative. And my initial reaction was, hold on here. Let's be very cautious about making casual analogies because it can run the risk of actually sort of dishonoring the scale of the tragedy at Tiananmen in '89.
Yeah,
that's actually, we're talking about a huge loss of life in a matter of days in Beijing and elsewhere. And then there are, of course, actually really interesting parallels. And one of them being this idea of a leadership that is fortifying itself against its own people. That, for me, is the part that rises to the surface. Anytime you end up in a situation in which a leadership either sort of physically, geographically, or ultimately, those are all reflections of like spiritually and intellectually, they are literally barricading themselves against their own citizenry. And that's what's happening right now in Washington. And that's what happened in Beijing in '89. So even if we can bracket the comparison by saying, let's not get into the business of casually invoking Tiananmen all the time because it undermines the seriousness of what happened in '89, it is true that there is some really fascinating parallel there, I think.
And how about the sort of executive military branch tensions? Of course, famously in Tiananmen, there were leaders of the military as well as troops who were not at all down with the program, which is a tension that we've certainly seen play out with, the Secretary of Defense coming out and saying we don't want to do this and have active military on the ground.
Yeah, and another comparison that's super interesting is that here in Washington, there are National Guard units from around the country, so from Utah, for instance, or elsewhere. And what I found fascinating is that was a feature of the military strategy at Tiananmen, was to get military units from far away from Beijing so that they felt no personal connection to the people in the capital. And oftentimes they regarded the people in the capital as these kinds of, privileged elite kids, spoiled brats, basically, who were coming and rising up and so on. And it's not a stretch to see some similar kind of over the mountains and over the mountains to Utah from the palace here in Washington, bringing people in who don't feel connected to it. There is something eerie about that. I was very struck by that as I looked at those images of the men in uniform at the Lincoln Memorial, which I think for a lot of us kind of crystallized this thing, the moment, and thinking to myself, what's going on in that man's mind as he thinks about the people here before him, because there is that vast divide. I don't want to quite say urban rural, because in some cases it's not really that, but it is definitely power center and province.
Yeah, I mean, it's really GOP Democrat as much as anything else. Where you saw a sort of series of Republican governors like offering up their tribute of 500 or 1,000 National Guard members. So not to just rag on Utah.
One of the moments that I was really struck by was, not only having the mayor of Washington write Black Lives Matter in huge type down the middle of the asphalt so that Trump can see it from his helicopter when he flies away. I mean, that's an amazing moment of political expression playing out. But also the fact that Arlington County, Virginia, and forgive me if I get some of the facts here wrong, but I think this is right. They withdrew their National Guard, or they withdrew their cops. Actually, it was their cops, because they felt like they weren't being used responsibly in Washington. It's extraordinary sort of exhibit of the nature of American governance, that you have these different levels of the federalist system at war with one another. And if you want to find a positive thing there, and there is something positive, it's that this is all happening, and it's happening in public, and that we're sort of watching as different political leaders are using the power that they have to check one another. And that's better than the alternative, which is having a central executive that is steamrolling over everything without the ability for these other layers to impede it.
Yeah. So Joseph Torigian, who's a Western political scientist, wrote a piece a few years ago doing a sort of retrospective on what we know now about the decision-making that led up to the Tiananmen crackdown. And one of his sort of hypotheses, which I think is fascinating to think about in the context of, June in America 2020, is the idea that, and I'm quoting here, it is possible that Deng understood that the process could be diffused without violence, but feared that such a solution would have created an uncontrolled political space with unforeseen long-term implications. Deng was clearly afraid about protests becoming a regular feature of the political landscape and making the reform and opening process more difficult.
I think, in a way, I have a hard time drawing too close a comparison between Deng and Trump, simply because, for all of Deng's failures, and some of them are profound and historic, he was of a different nature and totally different order of kind of political leadership. He'd done the reading, to be blunt about it. Like, he was coming from a very different biography. So, but I think, I think Trump is basically operating from a fairly thin personal playbook, a combination of kind of adrenal impulses and moments of political self-protection. And Deng, made a catastrophic error at Tiananmen Square, but he was also probably operating with some more theory behind it, even if the theory was wrong.
I think the sort of thinness of his thinking really reflects back to this quote that he gave in 1990 to Playboy, back when Playboy was a place that did journalism. He said that Trump said that, quote, when students poured into Tiananmen Square, the Chinese government almost blew it, but they were vicious, they were horrible, and they put it down with strength. That shows you the power of strength. Our country is right now being perceived as weak, is being spit on by the rest of the world. So, Trump clearly wasn't thinking, oh, this will be good for, Gaiga Kaifang. But I think there's some gut level where he just doesn't want to be shown up and sees folks marching in uniform as something that's a show of strength and makes him feel stronger when, we'll get to this. Obviously, this is shows just how weak he is as a president.
What I found interesting about that quote is, in some ways, Trump has been consistent over the years in his adulation of raw force. And it's interesting, too, because you could take that quote that he gave to Playboy in 1990 and you could say, well, I wonder if Xi Jinping in a private moment would say something like that. And he probably would. The difference, of course, is that Xi Jinping is cannier about what he says in public. So even Xi Jinping might not praise Tiananmen in quite those terms. So, of course, we know that he would agree with the disposition and what they did. But it begins to help you then understand, why does Trump look at people like Xi Jinping or leaders who have that power of use of force, and why does he admire them so much? It's not, sometimes we wonder, is it simply the scale of China's economy? Is it the kind of gilded glamour of life in Beijing? Is it one party state? What is it? I think on the most basic level, it's the application of force and the potential to use that is the chief seduction for Donald Trump when it comes to why he likes authoritarianism so much.
So, it's funny. It's funny you brought that up, because Xi, when he goes to Davos, which God knows if that's ever going to happen again, but he goes to Davos and he gives a speech, and the delivery is convincing. right?
Yeah.
He's not sitting up there like Trump would when he's told to give a speech which he doesn't maybe 100% believe in, and he's rolling his eyes and like skipping every third sentence, but like there's just a level of game playing which he
hmm
is clearly operating at a higher level than this president. But it's
hmm
interesting to think, you said, like, would Trump really rather prefer to be in a different leading not
hmm
necessarily a democracy but a different system? And
hmm
it's funny to me thinking about this, because in order to rise up a communist apparatchik, you really, like, yes, you need the head start of having your father have a revolutionary credentials or whatnot, but there's also like a lot of games and like
Yeah.
interpersonal dynamics that need to be played.
Yeah.
And if Trump was not elected president, like, there is no way that he would win any bureaucratic power
Totally.
struggle.
Yeah. No, that's actually, I mean, all of us have heard from Chinese friends and counterparts this idea that, the system in which you groom a leader through all of these levels, where they first are, they're the head of the local grain association, then eventually they're the county chair, and then this and this and this, that it does introduce a level of, they acquire almost a physical vocabulary of how you behave in certain settings, how you give deference to the person who is the leader above you. And I actually think what's interesting is in American politics, there's some elements of that. Not always. Obviously, we do have more of a belief in the idea of a transcendent political figure who can kind of, in their first run for office, go into some senior role. But there are bits of political theater that we have in Washington too. I mean, you spend 5 minutes watching the Senate, and you kind of see some of those bits of the ways in which people give deference to one another, and that's partly self-serving. They're sort of making their way up, but then we're living in this period now when there are people who are blowing that up.
So we've done Trump as dung, but let's do Trump as Mao. So
Mm.
you tweeted a quote from Lin Biao from the great Frank Dideker quadrilogy,
Yeah.
a historian of modern China. Lin said that, quote, Mao worships himself, has blind faith in himself, adores himself, will take credit for every achievement, but blame others for his failures. So, I mean, there's clearly some difference in the way that the anxieties and insecurities have played out in the minds of Donald Trump and Mao Zedong. But I'm curious for your sort of reflections on the two.
I have a problem, Jordan, which is that I've exhausted my reservoir for Trump psychoanalysis because I got interested in it when he was a candidate, and I got obsessed with it. And I wrote a lot about like trying to understand how the hell we'd gotten ourselves into this situation. And that was like a long time ago now. And it feels to me like the tank is empty. I'm sort of kidding, because actually the tank refills itself once a new moment arrives. And this moment right now of the protest movement, which seems to be challenging not just Trump, obviously, but an entire embedded system of injustice, is a moment that revives your focus on what Trumpism represents. So, but to go back to your point, yes, there are delicious points of comparison between Trump and Mao,
Sure.
and it goes to anybody who imagines themselves as a figure of salvation. I mean, that's part of the risk of, like, I have a soft spot for documentaries about cults. And anytime you watch something like that, you are reminded of the elements of kind of the catastrophes of overly charismatic leadership. And I mean charismatic in the technical sense, not as a normative compliment. But yeah, so it always happens that way.
So, the protest movement has been something that's been covered very aggressively within media in China and has now been turned into a sort of political weapon. I'm curious if you could sort of prognosticate about what this protest movement and the government's response is, what impact it has on U.S.-China relations and America's place in the world.
I think this protest movement, which is obviously being watched very closely around the world, is a sign of how the United States is struggling internally to prove that it's living up to the aspirations it expects of itself and other countries. I mean, to be blunt about it, it gets a lot harder to go and tell the Burmese government that you need to do better in protecting the rights of minorities and restricting the arbitrary use of force when we're having a movement in our own country that is demanding those very improvements. And that's good, actually, that we're being, in a sense, we're this is actually a hard one to get right, Jordan, and I am glad we're talking about it because it's really important. Like, I'm going through this process right now, thinking to myself, okay, I've spent the last few years, or I've spent the last 2 decades, really, sort of, writing from other countries about oftentimes human rights problems in those countries, and I come to it as an American with some sense that yes, we are in this ongoing multi-century struggle of our own to try to live up to our core aspirations, whether it's equal opportunity, equal rights, a truly free press, and so on, protections for minorities and for women and for vulnerable people. And I think, chastened and made more humble by this period of recognizing just how much work has to be done in this country for us to even say that we're an agent for those values around the world. That's
Yeah.
the honest answer.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two sides to this coin. There's the obvious one that you spoke to with Burma. There's the one talking about sort of mainstream Chinese public opinion. I've had a few conversations with friends. The stuff I read on social media, it's like 美国乱了, like 中国多么的好.
Yeah.
Like look
Mm-hmm.
at how, isn't it great that we don't have to put up with this shit? But there's also from sort of mainstream Chinese who see any sort of action on the streets as dangerous and scary, and that of course is
Mm-hmm.
amplified by every video you see on Douyin, every state media broadcasts only showing people burning Targets and
Yep.
Nike
Yep.
stores. But I think the point you alluded to, Evan, is really important. Is that like I think there's and I imagine this was also sort of the dynamic in 2003 with all the anti-war protests around Bush, is that like it's important for the world to know that not everyone's like on board with what's going on in the White House. And with Trump being such an outsized media personality and so easy to cover around the world, like it's understandable. But I think just seeing all the protests that all the solidarity movements that you've seen in all these capitals in Europe and South America, it makes you hopeful that like enough people still believe that America's like can be something good.
Yeah, I actually think there's two ways you can look at it. So there's the superficial reaction to what's going on in the United States. That's what you see sometimes from a kind of triumphalist, nationalist Chinese perspective, which is, aha, see, American democracy's always been a fiction and a lie, and better to have suppression and quiet than to have open, sometimes violent protest. And the reaction is no. Like, silence is often a sign of the absence of political movement towards, let's say, bending the arc of justice. I'm going to borrow from, my colleague Joe Lepore at The New Yorker, who has made the really, I think, important, sort of profound point. It's more than a point. It's a theme of a lot of the work she's doing, that oftentimes, like, protest is painful and is also the sign that you're moving in the direction of something better. And one of the things that we see in China is that the inability to have that protest, it's not only dangerous for the government to not really understand how where and what kind of dissatisfaction there is, it's also a sign that it's not moving in the direction of greater fulfillment of those kinds of aspirations. So, and then so that's part of it. And then there's the other side of it, which is like, so yeah, American democracy as a brand is being harmed over the course of these few years by the election of Donald Trump, the let's call it shorthanded, by the violence he has done to America's governance. And then at the same time, what we're witnessing right now, what the world is witnessing, is that Americans actually believe enough in these concepts to go into the streets about them and to risk themselves and their personal interests in order to try to push the country into a better place. So that's good.
Yeah. So, we've been talking a fair amount about the president and the current sort of state of U.S.-China relations post-coronavirus, which we've talked a lot about on the show, is likely is perhaps some folks have said it. I guess you've said in your piece is at an all-time low probably since Nixon. But
Yeah.
I think still important to sort of look back and reflect on to what extent this was all predestined.
Yeah. Hmm.
So, what's your take? What are the contingencies worth thinking about that could have sort of changed the relationship over the past, 20, I guess 30 years
Yeah.
now?
Well, here's an interesting point. Why would we say Nixon in 72 versus Carter in 79, right? That's when relations were actually normalized. And so the reason why I think there's a distinction that's meaningful is that when you say that this is the worst point in US China relations since 79, what you're implying is that in the years before the formal normalization of relations, that things were more tense than they are now, when actually the crucial ingredient was there in the 72 to 79 period, which is a fundamental belief in
Yeah.
a shared notion of the direction. I mean, even if they were wary of each other, they believed that they were heading towards a common destination, which was trying to bring these two huge powers, China's case, soon to be a huge power, into alignment with each other. And that's the thing that is missing today, is that we actually have, and that gets to your point about predestination here, that to some degree, whether or not Trump was president and whether or not he introduced his kind of grab bag of China tactics, not quite even strategy, that you had a case where the two powers have lost the much more important ingredient, which is a shared notion of what the future looks like to some degree. I'm not pretending that China ever imagined they were going to become a democracy. I think that's a straw man. I think what I'm saying is that they at least imagined, both sides, that there was some companionable way for these two to get along with each other. And that had begun to erode over the course of the last few years, even before Trump. It's gotten much, much stronger under Trump. That sense of confrontation, but it was happening. I think, we often ask the question, oh, okay, how much of this would have happened if Trump hadn't come to power? It's an interesting question, which is how much of this would have happened if Xi Jinping hadn't come to power? That's actually
Yeah.
a much harder one to answer, because how much is Xi Jinping a product of this lower trust of the United States, this higher tolerance for confrontation, all those kinds of questions? I don't know. I mean, I'd be curious what you think.
I mean, Li Keqiang just seems like much less of an asshole. He's
To
like
use the
he's like
technical
not
term, yeah.
he's like not a son of a bitch, and like him as like less of a son of a bitch, like that's the part that gets put forward, right? Because he's in
Yeah.
this role where he's doing economic policy, and he's like liberalizing the food stalls and talking about poverty all the time, and clearly these are things that he cares about, right? But
Hmm.
when you're the top dog, you also have to deal with the US, with the trade war, with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And like, it's not inconceivable that he would sort of draw the same conclusions if like his if the place that he was in was different from the place he is now. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's hypothetical number one. Like Bossy Lai, I mean, who the fuck knows what would have happened
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
with him with him running the show.
I do think that in a way, the Xi Jinping that we all began to see in 2013, 2014, when, let's remember, Donald Trump was still hosting The Apprentice. But that person is very much the person that we see now. So Xi Jinping arrived in office with
Yeah,
a
that's true.
vision for what he wanted to do. And I think the degree to which that's gotten heightened or accelerated because of Trump is a separate question. But I think I really do. I'm of the view that like she represented a fundamental break. That might be overstating it, but that she did represent a new direction for the leadership. And I have this debate, like an ongoing debate with friends who follow China, about how much was all of this, or was the train already in motion? And sure, it's true. Like under Hu Jintao, you did see a tightening up. There's just no question that post 2008, you saw this trend towards tightening up. But degree matters, and it entered a whole new phase. And then one last thing I'll mention on that subject of like leadership and why it matters is that part of the reason why it matters that Xi Jinping is the leader of the party is that he has an effect on all of the people underneath him who, might behave in one way or another, but given the fact that he's the leadership, they take the maximalist
Yeah.
authoritarian position. And there's something similar with Trump. You see people who might operate on a bandwidth spectrum of different behaviors, but because he is the boss and kind of validates these things, then they end up taking that maximalist position. So that's the effect over time.
So I've asked this to a few guests now, but we'll throw it to you as well. Is there any way this improves with Xi still in power?
I can see it improving. Yeah, actually. I can't give you a roadmap for how that happens, but I think that one thing that's worth keeping in our minds about it is that she is not delusional about China's ability to win a real war with the United States. I think that's worth keeping in mind. Like, he might have an overinflated sense of how China would handle a specific point of conflict. Like, he might be reckless about his use of particularly assets at sea. But I don't think he believes that China would emerge stronger from a real conflict with the United States. Now, I know that's kind of going a little far down the runway in terms of your question, but like, that is an outer bound on what I think they're willing to do.
I mean, that's a tricky framing, Evan, because like all it takes is one sort of miscalculation, right?
Yeah.
She thinks, all right, like Megalwama, like they don't, let's play with Taiwan and see what happens. And then all of a sudden, a lot of things get out of his control. And regardless that he has this prior that like American carriers aren't as shitty as some of his admirals think they are, you still end up in a really, really scary situation because he has this other prior, which is that Taiwan's defenses aren't all there. He has either the prior that Taiwan's defenses aren't all they're cracked up to me, or like net this is still a positive for my domestic political position, for like the glory of China.
You've kind of persuaded me, and so you did, I have to say, set out a hard task, which is, in the midst of a global pandemic with Trump as president and the U.S.-China at their worst point in the history of the relationship, is there any conceivable course for optimism? And I tried, and I think I kind of failed.
You know what also really bummed me out, and this is less serious than a war in Taiwan, but as listeners know, I spent a fair amount of time following Chinese hip hop. And what I found really remarkable over the past few weeks is the extent to which the like global K-pop fandom has really gotten behind Black Lives Matter. And BTS fans from South Korea and Brazil and Japan and even within China have like donated, I think, over $1 million to various, bail funds and police reform causes. The hip hop artists in China who have made their livings off of Black culture and, oftentimes say, hey, like, look at us. We respect our elders. And like, if you don't listen to like Big Pun, then you're not real hip hop and whatever. The silence I've seen from them is just so depressing. And you try to look at things like cultural connections and the fact that so many Chinese love basketball and listen to American music and whatnot as sort of hope for the future. But if even the folks that their lives are built off of Black culture in America, like, think either that it's too dangerous for them to say Black Lives Matter on their domestic Weibo's, or it just doesn't resonate to them as something that's important. It's just so disheartening. And
that's a really important insight, actually. Yeah, you're onto something there. I mean, I think it's probably a measure of all of those things. I mean, a degree of, there's a level of self-censorship. There's probably also a level that they frankly just feel they are actually, they don't feel connected to that American experience. And that's telling of itself.
It was interesting because a fair amount of them either like posted very pro-government things during Hong Kong. And that is something I can not forgive, but understand, given the sort of media environment they've grown up in and given the pressure that they're facing. Like, when every other Chinese celebrity on Weibo is saying, go Jiao, like Hong Kong police. And if you're not the one saying that puts you in a very difficult situation. But this is like, I feel like there would be more room to run as someone who just wanted to make a statement or, give $1,000 or whatever. And the fact that didn't happen is really really, really
I
upsetting.
mean, I think it's probably, it's a reflection of how the civil rights movement and the Black freedom struggle has been described in Chinese education. It's
Yeah.
not there. It's never like drawn as something with relevance for Chinese people today. That's one thing. And then what I think is something also. This reminds me of what I've always found to be a persistently interesting question, which is why K-pop is so successful around the world and Chinese pop culture is not. And that's, as is a source of incredible frustration to certainly China's political leadership, but also to some degree Chinese artists who will often be frustrated by that. And depending on their level of independence and awareness, they will either recognize and blame the censorship system for that, or they will have other explanations. But I think part of this just shows you that in some ways the K-pop world has been is more awake to these kinds of these global phenomena than the Chinese hip hop world is, and that's an interesting point actually, because to the outside observer, they might you might sort of gloss over the distinctions.
So speaking of sort of like international cultural capital, in this January piece you wrote about U.S.-China relations, you had the pleasure of speaking to none other than Judd Apatow, which I'm sure was a first on the U.S.-China beat for someone like yourself, Evan. So the point was that, and I think this is like a truth pretty long established now, that major Hollywood studios are scared of having things in scripts, of casting particular actors that would upset the mainland market. But it just sort of occurred to me that there's one giant studio pool of money which has zero China exposure, which is of course Netflix. So and I
Yeah.
think they've probably gotten the message at this point. The Mark Zuckerberg running in China, like hopeful that one day we'll be let in moment, I think is probably gone forever for the Netflix team. So say you decide that running around and talking to protesters is just not what you want to do for the next 10 years, Evan. If you wanted to pitch a docudrama, a scripted show, delving into Chinese society or Chinese politics to the execs up at Netflix, what topics do you think deserve their own dance review?
I've always thought that the best description of Washington politics, having moved here, is not House of Cards, it's Veep. And Veep captures all of the sort of vanities and the small ways in which people make bad decisions all the time. And one of the things that we don't get when we talk about Chinese politics is some of that. I think that would be amazing. I mean, I would love to see a show about that. I mean, we sometimes talk about Death of Stalin as such an interesting window into the nature of authoritarian governments and why people do the things they do. And I've often, Death of Stalin is an appropriate reference for understanding Trump world these days
Yeah.
too, because all of that sort of the myth making and the creating of worlds around him and so on. I would love to see something funny about Chinese politics. We don't see that very often. I think it's worth also pointing out here, in spirit of our conversation, we're talking about some really serious stuff, and we're talking about grave stuff, and people's lives are on the line. So I don't want people to think that when we can laugh about it, that we're making jokes about it. It's sort of not that. It's like we're finding the mordant moments of light and levity within a subject that we've thought a lot about and we care about, And so the fact that Veep is like an amazing portrait of Washington is not to make light of the seriousness of what happens in Washington, but in fact is a pretty powerful insight into the role of individual persona and personality when it comes to these huge decisions that impact lots of people. I find that really revealing.
I'm sold. I'll invest. The maybe $4 we're gonna make from recording this show. Um, so Evan, any sort of broader reflections to sum up the differences you've had just reporting on the U.S. over the past 6 years versus your stint on the mainland?
Yeah, in the sense, I spent a long time living overseas and reporting on political culture in other places. Lived in Egypt and reported a lot in Iraq and lived in China, obviously, and and then did a lot around those regions. And in some ways, coming back to the United States has been a process of coming to understand and trying to answer the question for myself of how we became so alienated from the values that we try to project around the world. And I actually feel almost like a personal responsibility to go back
Yeah.
and begin to answer that question. Like, how did we actually lose our ability to to give people social mobility of the kind that we at least purport to protect? And how did we lose sight of the ability to protect our most vulnerable people? Those issues feel not just relevant on a domestic basis, but also for how the rest of the world thinks about the United States. And I feel like I've got a hand in that process, and that kind of feels like a something I need to do.
Well, as one of the few journalists who still has a job and a platform with which to explore those questions, I am frankly glad that you are one of those trying to work this all out for us.
For
Evan,
having me today. Yeah,
thank
I
you,
appreciate it.
so much on China Talk. This was fascinating.
This was a lot of fun. Thanks, Jordan.
So I know it's cliche to use Martin Luther King quotes nowadays, but over the past week, I've been listening back to some of the audio of his speeches and have found them incredibly powerful and sustaining. I want to play for everyone a snippet from the end of Martin Luther King's March 1965 speech, delivered outside of the Alabama State House at the conclusion of the Selma to Montgomery March. If you have 7 minutes right now, you really owe it to yourself to stop whatever you're doing and listen.
My people, listen. Yes, sir. The battle is in our hands. Yes, sir. The battle is in our hands in Mississippi and Alabama and all over the United States. Yes, sir. I know that is a cry today in Alabama. We see it in numerous editorials. When will Martin Luther King, SCLC, SNCC, and all of these civil rights agitators and all of the white clergymen and labor leaders and students and others get out of our community and let Alabama return to normalcy? I have a message that I would like to leave with Alabama this evening. That is exactly what we don't want, and we will not allow it to happen. Yes, sir. For we know that it was normalcy in Marion that led to the brutal murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson. It was normalcy in Birmingham that led to the murder on Sunday morning of 4 beautiful, unoffending, innocent girls. It was normalcy on Highway 80. Yes, sir. That led state troopers to use tear gas and horses and billy clubs against unarmed human beings who were simply marching for justice. Yes, it was normalcy by a cafe in Selma, Alabama, that led to the brutal beating of Reverend James Redd. Yes, it is normalcy all over our country. Yes, sir. Which leaves the Negro perishing on the lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. It is normalcy all over Alabama that prevents the Negro from becoming a registered voter. No, we will not allow Alabama to return to normalcy. Only normalcy that we will settle for is the normalcy that recognizes the dignity and worth of all of God's children. The only normalcy that we will settle for is the normalcy that allows judgment to run down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. The only normalcy that we will settle for is the normalcy of brotherhood, the normalcy of true peace, the normalcy of justice. And so as we go away this afternoon, let us go away more than ever before, committed to this struggle and committed to nonviolence. I must admit to you that there are still some difficult days ahead. We are still in for the season of suffering. In many of the Black Belt counties of Alabama, many areas of Mississippi, many areas of Louisiana. I must admit to you, there are still jail cells waiting for us. Dark and difficult moments. We were born with a faith that nonviolence and its power can transform dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows. We will be able to change all of these conditions. So I plead with you this afternoon as we go ahead to remain committed to nonviolence. Our aim must never be to defeat or humiliate the white man, but to win his friendship and understanding. We must come to see that the end we seek is a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience. That will be a day not of the white man, not of the black man. That will be the day of man as man. I know you're asking today, how long will it take? Somebody's asking, how long will prejudice blind the visions of men, darken their understanding, and drive bright-eyed wisdom from her sacred throne? Somebody's asking, when will wounded justice, lying prostrate on the streets of Selma, Birmingham, and communities all over the South, be lifted from this dust of shame to reign supreme among the children of men? Somebody's asking, when will the radiant star of hope be plunged against the nocturnal bosom of this lonely night? Plucked from weary souls the chains of fear and the manacles of death. How long will justice be crucified and truth buried? Yes, sir. I come to say to you this afternoon, however difficult the moment, yes, sir, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth crushed to earth will rise again. Yes, sir. How long? Not long. Yes, sir. Because no lie can live forever. Yes, sir. How long? Not long. Because you shall reap what you sow. Yes, how long? Not long. How long? Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yes, that scaffold sways the future. Behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. How long? Not long. Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. How long? Not long. Because mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He's trampling out the village where the grapes of wrath are stored. He's loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He is sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. Oh, be swift, my soul, to answer him. Be jubilant, my feet. Our God is marching on. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.